right, get ready to dive deep because today we're tackling Oracle CPQ migration. We've got a ton of technical documentation to unpack, all about how to move your CPQ setup smoothly, safely, without a hitch.
Yeah, but it's more than just moving, right? It's like this whole strategic thing for managing your whole CPQ setup.
Definitely. And the documentation actually uses this really interesting word for it, teleportation. Might sound a bit out there, but it actually makes sense when you really think about it.
Right, like imagine having to rebuild each product, every single rule, all the settings by hand, every time your system needs even a small update. Migration lets you skip all that.
It's almost like pressing fast forward, right?
Yeah.
But like a safe fast forward. Speaking of safe, the documentation talks a lot about how important it is to have granular control during migration. Why is that so important?
Well, imagine you're a surgeon, right? You don't want to do a whole body transplant if you only need to fix one small thing. Granular control means you can be super precise and just migrate, say, a single pricing rule without messing with anything else. Minimizes risk, right?
Like doing surgery on your CPQ setup instead of a full-on transplant. Makes total sense. And talking about targeted stuff, the documentation mentions these things called packages. What are those all about?
So packages, think of them like pre-made bundles of functionality. So like pricing rules, product configs, approval workflows, all packaged up neatly so you can easily move them around between different environments.
So like if you're setting up for a new client, instead of rebuilding everything from scratch, boom, you just deploy the package.
Exactly, saves a ton of time. And what's really cool is that you can even get in there and pick and choose specific parts within the package to move. It's super flexible.
Nice. That level of flexibility seems super useful, especially when you're dealing with a complex CPQ setup. Now, onto the stuff that maybe isn't as straightforward. What are some things that the documentation says you can't migrate?
Good question. So as great as migration is, it can't do everything. Certain things like accounts and transactions need a different approach.
Oh, is that because of the sensitive data involved?
Exactly. You don't want to just be moving that stuff around carelessly. For those, the documentation suggests things like bulk upload download, which are designed to be more secure for sensitive data.
So it's all about using the right tool for the job. Sometimes you need a scalpel, sometimes you need a sledgehammer. Okay, now this is where I think it gets really interesting. The documentation stresses the importance of doing things in a specific order during migration. They use the example of needing the util library in place before you move other things, like configuration or commerce data. Can you break down what this util library even is and why it's so crucial?
Sure. So the util library, it's almost like the foundation of your CPQ setup. It's got all these essential functions and utilities that other parts rely on. You need to migrate it first so that everything else has what it needs to work properly once it arrives.
Okay, so like making sure the plumbing and electrical are all good before you start decorating a house. Makes sense.
Right. And the documentation has some really good examples to illustrate this. You wouldn't want to migrate a complex pricing rule before the data table it depends on is in place, right?
Total recipe for disaster. And speaking of disasters, the documentation also talks about these things called rollbacks and snapshots. How do those work as like safety nets during migration?
So think of a rollback like an undo button. If something goes wrong, you can essentially rewind to how your CPQ environment was before.
Oh, that's reassuring. So like if I accidentally migrate the wrong rules or something, I can just hit undo and breathe again.
Exactly. And snapshots take that safety net a step further. It's like taking a picture of your CPQ setup at a specific moment. Let's say you're about to make a big change and you want a safety net. You can make a snapshot first.
So you basically have a restore point to go back to, like a time machine for your CPQ. Okay, I've got to ask this. It's the question that always comes to mind. What about moving between completely different versions of Oracle CPQ? Is that even possible?
It's a really good question, and a lot of people ask that. The short answer is it can be really tricky. Migrating between versions has its limitations.
So like upgrading from an older version to a newer one might require some extra steps.
Yeah, exactly. But there is some good news. From version 19A onwards, they added this feature called forward version package migration that can be helpful in some cases. It basically lets you package things up and move them to a newer version without manually recreating everything.
Sounds pretty handy. Although I imagine there are some catches.
There are some, yeah. The documentation is very specific about what's supported, so it's really important to read carefully and understand what will and won't migrate smoothly.
Thorough planning, always key. All right, let's bring this to life a bit. The documentation talks about migrating an entire commerce process. What does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, imagine you have this whole process set up on your source site, like your standard sales quote to order workflow, and you want to replicate it exactly on your target site. Migration lets you move that whole process without manually recreating each step.
So it's like a copy paste for your workflow.
Yeah, basically. But here's where the granular control we talked about before comes in handy. What if you only want to migrate a few specific changes you made to that workflow? You can choose to just migrate those specific updates, not the whole thing.
So you can surgically update parts of it without messing with the rest.
Yes, cool.
And I noticed the documentation also mentions migrating even smaller elements within a commerce process. Like, what kinds of elements are we talking about?
Oh, you can get really granular. Let's say you just need to update a couple of fields in a document template that's part of that commerce process. You can migrate just those fields without touching anything else.
Wow, that's impressive. Talk about control. One thing that really stood out to me in the documentation was this idea that if you create a component manually, it's not treated the same as one that's been migrated, even if they have the same name. Can
Yeah.
you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, it's subtle but important. Even if they look identical on the surface, Oracle CPQ is tracking where each component came from and how it got there, like a family tree for your CPQ components.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about having the same name, it's about the origin story of the component.
Right, and this matters because, for example, the documentation says you can't migrate a component if one already exists with the same name but was created manually. It'll throw an error.
So you can't just sneak one past Oracle CPQ. It's reassuring in a way. It's like
Right.
they really thought about maintaining the integrity of the system.
Exactly. They've got these safeguards in place to prevent conflicts and make sure everything stays consistent.
Okay, so we've talked about what can be migrated, what can't, the importance of order. What about any limitations to migration in general? We talked about accounts and transactions, but anything else people should know about?
Yeah, so migration is great, but it can't handle absolutely everything. One thing that comes to mind is document engine documents. Basically, these are the templates for generating different documents within CPQ. Those can't be directly migrated.
So if you have a custom template, you can't just move it over as is.
Right. You'd need to recreate it manually or look for other options like export import if they're available. It's important to be aware of these little exceptions.
Absolutely. Always good to read the fine print. Any other limitations we should be thinking about?
Well, we talked about dependencies being important, right? Sometimes those dependencies can also lead to limitations. Like if you have something customized that relies on a feature not available in the target site's version of CPQ, it might not migrate correctly or it might not work as expected.
So always double check those dependencies. It's like trying to bake a cake without all the ingredients is just not going to work.
Exactly. Always best to compare your source and target environments carefully and make sure everything lines up. When in doubt, Oracle support or an implementation partner can help you figure things out.
Always good to have backup. All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing that I found super interesting in the documentation, this idea of cross-process migration. What is that, and why would someone use it?
Cross-process migration is a really cool feature that lets you move things between different commerce processes without having to migrate the entire process itself.
So instead of moving a whole workflow, I can pick and choose specific pieces from one and put them into another.
Yes, exactly. It's like being able to swap out ingredients in a recipe. You might have two processes that use the same pricing approval workflow, for example. This way, you don't have to maintain two separate copies.
Huh. So it helps keep things consistent and reduces redundancy. Makes sense. What kind of things can you actually move using this cross-process migration?
You can migrate quite a few things. Util libraries, product definition elements, catalog entries, configuration rules, data tables, even file manager elements. It's pretty versatile.
Sounds like it, but I'm guessing there are some limits.
There are, yeah. The documentation is pretty clear about what's supported. You can migrate individual attributes or rules, for example, but not entire document engine documents or some of those more complex commerce objects.
So again, it's all about understanding the boundaries and checking that documentation.
For sure. But within those boundaries, it's a powerful tool.
Absolutely. It sounds like cross-process migration is a bit like having a really precise set of tools for fine-tuning your CPQ setup. Well, I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've talked about what migration is, why it's important, how it works, what to watch out for. And we even touched on some of the finer points like dependencies and those internal distinctions Oracle CPQ makes. It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's all super useful stuff. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
You're right. There's still so much more to unpack.
In our next part, I'm excited to dig deeper into best practices and common pitfalls.
Perfect. We'll talk about how to actually put all this into practice, avoid those common mistakes, and maybe even share some insider tips and tricks. But for now, let's leave our listeners with this thought. Oracle CPQ migration. It's not just a technical task, it's a strategic tool.
It's about understanding the nuances and using them to your advantage. And the more you know, the more powerful that tool becomes.
Very well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part 1. Catch us in the next part, where we'll continue our deep dive into the world of Oracle CPQ migration.
Ready to dive into those best practices we were talking about? The ones for making migration as smooth as possible.
You bet. Let's hear it. What does the documentation recommend for teams using this stuff?
So one of the first things they emphasize is having one person, one dedicated administrator, who's in charge of all the migrations.
Centralized control. Makes sense. So there's no confusion about who's doing what, like an air traffic controller for your CPQ setup.
Exactly. Keeps things consistent, reduces errors. That administrator becomes the go-to expert.
Speaking of experts, any tips on the actual migration process itself?
Yeah, the documentation talks a lot about keeping things moving in one direction. So typically you'd go from development to testing and then finally to production.
Like a carefully planned relay race, passing the baton from one stage to the next.
Exactly. Keeps everything in sync, prevents accidental overwrites. And actually, on a smaller scale, one little tip that stood out to me was about setting the source site URL to auto-populate when you connect from the target site. Sounds minor, but it saves time and typos.
Oh, I love those little efficiency hacks. Every second counts. Now, I know we briefly touched on this earlier, but cross-version migration, migrating between different versions, that sounds a bit hairy. The documentation mentions forward version package migration. What exactly is that?
Good catch. Yeah, that's a feature they introduced in version 19A, and it's designed to make cross-version migration a bit less painful. Basically, it lets you package up components, including anything they depend on, and migrate them to a newer version without having to manually recreate everything.
So it's like a protective capsule for your components, traveling through time to a new version of Oracle CPQ.
I love that analogy. And the documentation highlights a bunch of benefits: less migration time, fewer errors, better consistency between versions.
Sounds like a win-win. But I'm sure there's some buts in there somewhere.
Of course. The documentation does point out that it's not a magic solution. Not everything will always migrate perfectly.
So what should users watch out for? When is it not a good idea?
Compatibility is a big one. While this feature is built to handle most differences between versions, sometimes a component might rely on a feature that's no longer supported in the new version, or it might work differently.
So thorough testing is still crucial.
Absolutely. The documentation really stresses that test, especially in a sandbox environment before going live, especially with a new version.
Makes sense. Better to catch those issues early. Now let's talk about snapshots. We talked about them as a safety net, but I noticed the documentation also mentions limitations, especially with major Oracle CPQ upgrades. What's the deal there?
Yeah, that's a common point of confusion. Snapshots are fantastic for going back to a previous state within the same version, but after a major upgrade, they might not be as reliable.
So I can't just rely on a snapshot to roll back if a major upgrade goes sideways.
Usually not. The documentation says snapshots are often deleted during major upgrades because those upgrades can involve big changes to how Oracle CPQ stores and structures data.
So the snapshot might have data that's incompatible with the new version setup, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And while it seems counterintuitive, this actually highlights how important planning and backups are for big upgrades.
Okay, so if snapshots aren't foolproof for major upgrades, what's the best way to stay safe?
Backups, for one. Before any major upgrade, back up your entire Oracle CPQ environment. Your data, configurations, customizations, integrations, everything.
That way, if disaster strikes, you can always go back to the drawing board.
Exactly. Think of it as your CPQ insurance policy.
And what about testing in those cases?
Just as crucial, if not more so. The documentation really recommends having a separate testing environment that's as close to your live environment as possible. Same version, same setup, even similar data.
That way you can do a test run of the upgrade and see if any issues pop up before they hit your live system.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing risk and making sure the upgrade goes as smoothly as possible.
So, big takeaway. Snapshots are great for everyday use and smaller updates, but major upgrades need a more comprehensive approach with backups, thorough testing, and maybe even a rollback plan just in case.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about using the right tools and strategies for the specific situation.
It really highlights how important preparation is for those big changes. But let's circle back to something that came up earlier. This whole idea that if you make a component manually, it's not seen the same way as a migrated one, even if they look the same on paper. Why do you think Oracle CPQ even bothers making that distinction?
It's one of those little things that tells you a lot about how Oracle CPQ is built. Even if two components look the same on the surface, they might have totally different histories, different origins, different paths they took to get where they are, and Oracle CPQ is tracking all of that.
It's like they're keeping a detailed family tree for each component.
Exactly. And while the documentation doesn't go super deep into the technical stuff, you can tell it matters. Like, remember we talked about how you can't migrate a component if there's already one with the same name that was created manually? You get that error message.
Right, like Oracle CPQ is saying, hold on, I need to check this component's ID before I let you change anything.
Exactly. They've got all these checks and balances to prevent conflicts and keep your data squeaky clean. It's pretty impressive.
Definitely makes you feel a bit more secure. Well, before we wrap up our deep dive, I wanted to come back to something we touched on at the very beginning. This idea that Oracle CPQ migration is more than just a technical process, it's actually a strategic tool.
Couldn't agree more. And I think going through this documentation has really driven that point home. It's not just about moving data, it's about understanding how to use migration to your advantage, how to really manage and shape your CPQ environment.
It's about having the flexibility to adapt, the efficiency to streamline, and the control to keep everything running smoothly and accurately across your whole system.
It's about making Oracle CPQ work for you, not the other way around. And using migration strategically is a huge part of that.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, as you go forth and migrate, remember to think strategically. Don't get bogged down in the technical stuff. Keep the big picture in mind.
And don't be afraid to really explore the documentation. There's so many little nuggets of wisdom hidden in there.
It's all about turning that knowledge into power and using it to make your CPQ environment the best it can be.
Exactly. All right, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive. It's been a pleasure joining you.
Likewise. And thanks to all our listeners for tuning in. We hope you found this deep dive into Oracle CPQ migration valuable and maybe even a little bit fun. Until next time, happy migrating.